I still remember that morning clearly, when my mother-in-law called. Her voice was more cheerful than usual. She said she wanted to take Hannah, my daughter, to watch the parade with her cousins. "She needs to have more fun," she said brightly. I hesitated for a few seconds, but then I agreed. I wanted my daughter to fit in, to have a childhood full of happy memories. And more than anything, I trusted them. Hannah was 8 at the time, thin, quiet, always trying her best to be well-behaved. She tied her shoelaces carefully and asked me 3 times if she would be a bother to anyone. I stroked her hair and told her it was a happy day, that all she needed to do was smile. And she did. She smiled, her eyes as clear as morning sunlight. I had no idea it would be the last smile before she learned how to endure. The crowd that day was huge. People pressed against one another, laughter mixing with loud music in the air. I watched her small figure disappear into the sea of bodies. A faint sense of unease flickered inside me, but I pushed it aside. I told myself she was with her grandmother, her aunts, her cousins. She would be fine. But just over an hour later, my phone vibrated. It wasn't my mother-in-law's voice on the other end. It was a stranger. They said they had found a little girl sitting by the roadside, crying, her leg injured, too afraid to stand up. I went completely numb. In that moment, my heart felt like it dropped straight into a bottomless pit. Every sound around me faded into the distance. All I could hear was my own breathing, fast, uneven, out of control. I ran in panic, my mind blank except for one desperate thought: please don't let it be my child. When I saw Hannah curled up on the sidewalk, her dress dusty, her foot swollen and red, her eyes rimmed from holding back tears, it felt as if someone had crushed my heart in their hand. She looked up at me, her lips trembling. "Mom, I'm sorry. I walked too slowly." In that instant, I understood something devastating. My daughter hadn't just been left behind in a crowd, she had been left behind in her trust. And from that moment on, I knew there are wounds that don't bleed, yet follow a child for the rest of their life. If you understand this kind of pain, comment 1. I gathered Hannah into my arms. Her body felt so light, trembling like a baby bird knocked down by a storm. Her foot was swollen, blisters torn open and bleeding. I bit my lip to keep from breaking down. With every step I took, my heart ached as if someone were quietly tearing it apart. When we returned to my mother-in-law's house, the room was still filled with laughter and chatter. Everyone was eating and talking as though nothing had happened. I stood at the doorway, holding my child, my whole body shaking. No one had even noticed that Hannah was gone. "What happened to her?" my mother-in-law asked, her tone casual. I didn't answer right away. I set Hannah down on a chair and took off her shoes. The faint scent of antiseptic rose into the air, mingling with the smell of food in the room, creating a strange, nauseating mixture. My mother-in-law frowned as if trying to recall something. Then she said lightly. She said her feet hurt. She was walking too slowly. I looked straight into her eyes and asked slowly, "Where did you leave her?" For nearly 2 hours, in a sea of strangers. An 8-year-old child left alone, her feet bleeding, swallowed by a surging crowd. "And no one went back to look for her?" I asked, my voice trembling. Hannah's aunt shrugged. "She's a kid. She's overreacting. She needs to learn to be independent." I looked around. No one objected. No one seemed remorseful, only indifferent faces, as if leaving a child behind was perfectly normal. In that moment, I realized what hurt me most was not the wounds on my daughter's feet, but the coldness in people's hearts. Hannah gently squeezed my hand and whispered, "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to trouble everyone." I tightened my grip on her hand. A quiet anger rose inside me, slow but fierce. Not an explosive rage, but a cold, sharp resolve. I knew that from this moment on, I would no longer stay silent. Because if I continued to endure it, the one who would pay the price would be my child. "And maybe," my mother-in-law added casually. I told her to sit and wait for a bit. Who knew she couldn't keep up? Those words fell like a block of ice. My head rang. For a bit. In that instant, a line had been drawn, a boundary between endurance and something else entirely. That night, Hannah fell asleep very early. She was exhausted after a long day and a fear she could not put into words. I sat beside her bed, watching her small face slowly surrender to sleep, my heart heavy. The soft glow of the nightlight fell across her pale skin. Her long lashes trembled slightly, as if even in her dreams she had not truly found peace. I gently brushed a hand over her soft hair, careful not to wake her. In that moment, countless questions rose within me, unanswered. How had an 8-year-old child learned to apologize for being left behind? Where had she learned that? From cold stares, from prolonged silence, or from the quiet feeling of being a burden? I remembered the look in her eyes when she said, "I'm sorry. I was walking too slowly." There was no resentment in that gaze, no anger, only self-blame and a vague fear that she had done something wrong, a fear far too heavy for such a tender childhood. In the dark room, I sat there for a long time. I did not cry. I did not curse anyone. I simply let the pain seep in, little by little. Some wounds do not need screams or tears. They slip in silently, patiently, burrowing deep into the very roots of trust. I wondered what might have happened if I hadn't arrived in time, if no kind stranger had stopped, if Hannah had been left sitting there for a few more hours. I couldn't let my mind go any further. The thought was like a cold blade gliding across my heart, leaving behind a cut so thin, yet so deep. Outside, the wind gently stirred the curtains. The city was asleep. But inside me, something had quietly shattered. It wasn't anger, it was a silent awakening. I had trusted too easily in uncertain things. I had placed my child in hands that were not gentle enough. I leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. An unspoken promise echoed within me. From this day forward, no one would ever make her apologize for her own existence again. In that moment, I understood that protecting my child was not only about shielding her body, but also about guarding her faith in the goodness of the world. The next morning, when pale sunlight filtered through the window, I was still sitting by Hannah's bed. She slept soundly, her breathing steady, as if yesterday's nightmare had been nothing more than a brief dream. But for me, everything remained clear, heavy, impossible to erase. I walked into the living room. My mother-in-law was already seated there, holding a cup of cold tea. She looked at me cautiously. The warmth from the day before was gone, replaced by an invisible distance slowly widening between us. I sat down across from her. No evasions, no accusations. I simply asked, "If it had been your child yesterday, would you have left them behind like that?" She fell silent. A flicker of hesitation crossed her face before she sighed. "It's over now. You're only making things harder for everyone by blowing it out of proportion." Her answer fell softly, yet it carried the weight of stone. I felt an emptiness open inside me, a place where a fragile hope had once lived, the hope that they would understand. I nodded slowly, not because I agreed, but because there was nothing left to argue. My father-in-law walked in. After hearing the story, he frowned and said that children need to learn endurance, that a few hardships would make them stronger. I looked at him and wondered when a child's pain had come to be reduced to something as simple as a minor stumble. No one apologized. No one admitted fault. They spoke about inconvenience, about disrupted plans, about how I had overreacted. No one spoke about Hannah's fear, about her swollen red feet, about the 2 hours she had sat alone in the middle of a crowd. I realized I was standing in a world where my daughter's feelings had no room to exist. In that moment, a decision slowly took shape. Not dramatic, not impulsive, just a quiet but firm withdrawal. I would no longer entrust my child to people who did not consider her pain something serious. I stood up and bowed my head slightly, not out of submission, but to close something that no longer needed to remain open. As I walked out of that house, I felt a deep sadness, yet alongside it came a strange sense of relief, as if I had just set down a burden I had been carrying for far too long. Some doors hurt terribly when they close, but if we never close them, we may never discover that there is another path ahead, one that is quieter and safer for our child. The days that followed passed slowly, as if even time itself hesitated before my decision. Hannah gradually began walking again, but each step was light, cautious, as though she feared hurting herself once more. I watched quietly, saying little, simply staying near so she would know that no matter how indifferent the world might be, she still had a place to return to. I began setting my first boundaries. No more rushed visits. No more long phone calls filled with reproach disguised as concern. I responded more slowly, spoke less, and kept a silence wide enough to protect myself. At first, it filled me with guilt. I was afraid of being called ungrateful, of being misunderstood, of hurting others. But every time I looked at Hannah sleeping peacefully, I knew I could not turn back. One night, she suddenly woke and called softly, "Mom." I gathered her into my arms. Hannah whispered, "I'm scared of crowded places." Her voice was small, but the fear inside it was immense. I soothed her and promised she would not have to go anywhere she did not want to. In my embrace, she gradually relaxed, but inside me, a fine scratch etched itself just a little deeper. I came to understand that leaving is not only about physical distance, but about the journey of separating oneself from old patterns. It hurts, because we must let go of things we once called family. But if we are not brave enough to walk away, we will remain trapped in cycles that keep wounding our children. And so, in those slow-moving days, I learned to let go little by little. Not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, yet firmly. Because I knew that beyond this lingering ache lay another path, one where Hannah could grow up without having to apologize for who she is. In the days that followed, our lives gradually returned to a familiar rhythm, though softer and slower than before. Hannah began to smile more. Her steps grew steadier again, even if they sometimes hesitated. I took her to school and picked her up, holding her hand as we crossed small streets. The things that once seemed ordinary suddenly felt incredibly precious after what we had been through. In the evenings, we cooked together. Hannah carefully washed the vegetables and set the table, occasionally looking up to ask in a small voice, "Mom, am I doing this right?" I would nod and smile, telling her she didn't need to be perfect, trying her best was enough. Each time, I saw a faint light in her eyes, like a tender sprout just beginning to emerge. I also learned to listen to myself. On quiet nights, after Hannah had fallen asleep, I would sit by the window and let my thoughts drift slowly. I no longer blamed or tormented myself as I once had. I understood that some choices cannot please everyone, but they can preserve safety for the one you love most. At times, old memories still returned, gently knocking at my mind. The images from that day, my little girl sitting curled up by the roadside, her frightened eyes, her swollen red feet still made my heart tighten. But instead of avoiding them, I allowed myself to face them. I believed that only by accepting the pain could I truly move beyond it. We began creating new routines, afternoon walks in the park, quiet weekends reading side by side, unhurried breakfasts without rushing the clock. In those peaceful moments, I watched Hannah slowly reclaim her innocence. Her laughter rang out clear and bright, like a small melody dissolving the shadows. I came to understand that healing is not about forgetting, but about learning to live with the memory without letting it wound you again. And in that quiet journey, I realized that I, too, was healing not through grand gestures, but through small, ordinary, deeply human moments. We kept moving forward, slowly but steadily, carrying a new belief with us, that peace is not a gift given by others, but something we yield with our own hands for ourselves and for our children. The call came on a windless afternoon. My mother-in-law's number appeared on the screen, silent, yet heavy. I stared at it for a long moment before answering, a familiar feeling rising inside me, part anxiety, part exhaustion. On the other end, her voice was hoarse. The sharpness was gone, replaced by a layered weariness. She said she wanted to see Hannah. She said she missed her. I remained silent. In that instant, old memories returned, vivid enough to ache. I glanced at Hannah, who was sitting at the table drawing small, focused, peaceful. She had no idea that call existed, and perhaps she didn't need to. I agreed to meet at a small cafe. My mother-in-law arrived early, sitting in a quiet corner. She looked thinner than before. When I walked in, she lifted her eyes, a flicker of unease passing through them. We sat across from each other, separated by a long stretch of silence. Neither of us spoke at first. The words that once demanded to be said seemed to have run dry. She began talking about her recent difficulties, about the emptiness in the old house, about the sense of loss now that Hannah no longer visited. I listened without interrupting, but I did not allow my heart to soften. I understood that some loneliness is born from the choices adults make. "When can she come visit?" she asked quietly. I looked straight into her eyes and answered slowly. "When I'm certain she will be safe both physically and emotionally." She fell silent. A flicker of hurt crossed her face, then disappeared. There was no apology, no promise, only a quiet helplessness. We left the cafe without another word. On the way home, a gentle breeze carried the scent of late afternoon sunlight. I felt an emptiness inside me, but it no longer hurt. It was as if the last remaining thread had finally been untied, an unexpected lightness settling in its place. Some relationships cannot be saved by love from only one side. Some doors must be closed, not out of resentment, but for the peace of those we hold dear. And in that quiet afternoon, I understood that letting go is not always a loss. Sometimes, it is the only way for both sides to be free, each walking a very different path. After a storm, the sky does not always clear at once. There were days when I woke up with a strange emptiness. Everything had passed, yet the echoes remained, quietly gnawing at the hollow spaces in my heart. I no longer cried as I once did, but the sadness lingered low and persistent, like a scar that had not fully healed. Some afternoons, I would stand for a long time by the window, watching the hurried flow of people outside, wondering how a family could push one another to the edge of such hurt. I learned to accept that some relationships are not meant to hold us, but to teach us how to let go. Not everyone bound by blood knows how to love, and not every silence is weakness. Some silences are choices the only way to save oneself. I stopped blaming. I stopped trying to prove anything. I realized that the more I explained, the more I hurt myself. On long nights, I sat beside my daughter, listening to the steady rhythm of her breathing as she slept. That small face made my heart tighten. I realized that every wound I had ever endured became insignificant compared to the fear of her being hurt. I told myself I had to be stronger, not to win against anyone, but to become a steady refuge for a fragile soul who trusted me completely. Day by day, I slowly pieced myself back together. No rush, no noise. I learned to love myself, to tend to old wounds with a gentleness I had never once offered myself before. At times, sadness still swept in unexpectedly, but I no longer panicked. I let it pass, light as a breeze. And then I understood. Growing up does not mean no longer feeling pain. It means learning to live with it calmly. I no longer waited for an apology or understanding. I only hoped to remain peaceful enough to keep moving forward, carrying the lessons, but not the resentment. One morning, I suddenly realized I had stopped dreaming about the past. No more restless nights. No more images that tightened my chest upon waking. It happened quietly, as if the pain had grown tired and chosen to withdraw. I sat up and watched the sunlight spill through the crack in the door, my heart unexpectedly light. For the first time in a long while, I felt something simple and clear. I was alive, and I was okay. I began rebuilding small daily rituals, waking up early to brew a cup of tea, walking around the neighborhood, listening to the morning bird song. The things I once overlooked became my anchors. I learned to live more slowly, no longer pushing myself to be strong or unbreakable. It was enough to be steady enough to keep going. With each passing day, I felt myself soften like the surface of water after rain, no longer stirred by heavy ripples. My daughter laughed more often. Her laughter became the thread that stitched together the tears in my heart. I came to understand that happiness is not about having everything, but about holding on to what matters most. Hand in hand, we moved through very ordinary days, and yet, after so many storms, that very ordinariness felt like a rare luxury. At times, I still thought about the family I had left behind, not with blame, but as one remembers a chapter that has ended. I no longer felt resentment, nor did I expect anything. I let the memories rest where they were, like a closed book. They once caused me pain, but they also taught me the value of freedom and self-respect. I realized that forgiveness is not forgetting, it is choosing not to let the past control the present. When I finally let go, I felt